My name's Jack. I originally got to Oswald-Spengler through my studies of Arab and Islamic culture in the 20th century. So I was looking at how Arab philosophers, Islamic philosophers were interpreting their position vis-a-vis the West. And through that, I managed to find references to Oswald-Spengler's philosophy of history. And I found it quite unusual that there was a German name cropping up amongst all these Arab discussions about their own society. So I decided to look in further into Oswald-Spengler, and then here I am, 2 or 3 years later, having devoted the last few years to studying Oswald-Spengler and becoming entangled in his philosophy. I'm Jack. I'm at the University of Oxford. I first found Spengler through a different path. I was studying Arab and Islamic history, and I was looking at their interpretations of the West in the 20th century. And through some indirect path, I found a random German name cropping in amongst all these discussions of the West. And I decided to look into that further. And then I decided to follow through with Oswald-Spengler for the last 2 years, 3 years or so. So that's how I got to Spengler. So I'll really start again. So this paper is based upon my analysis of the Anglo-American newsprint, academic and literary reception of Oswald-Spengler from 1920 to 1975, where, I argue, there existed 3 interpretive periods in which his philosophy was interpreted as the result of particular social, political and philosophical contexts. The first of these 3 periods began in 1920 when Spengler's name arrived in the Anglo-American lexicon and ended in 1933. In this period, Spengler's philosophy was largely interpreted as a philosophic enunciation of pessimism, aligning to the context of the post-war world and the European culture crisis coming from the 19th century. By contrast, in the second interpretive period, from 1933 to the beginning of Hitler's dictatorship until its downfall in 1945, Spengler's philosophy was reanalyzed in the context of both his later writings and the rise of National Socialism to interpret his thought as advocating for revivalistic fascism. In the final interpretive period from 1945 to 1975, however, I argue that the pessimistic interpretation of Spengler's thought largely returned in the context of a second post-war world. In demarcating these 3 periods, it is my aim to demonstrate that the changing interpretations of Spengler's philosophy in the Anglo-American world align themselves to the context of the individual interpreter and their societal situation. After reading The Decline multiple times, Spengler's other works, along with primary and secondary source material, new interpretations, many contradictory, continually arose. As a result, I found it challenging to provide a definition for Spengler's philosophy that would separate it from other cyclical theories of civilizations, whilst respecting many of its valid interpretations. Ultimately, I found my solution within the varied interpretations themselves, both in defining his philosophy and in understanding its interpretations. I decided to use a postmodern approach to better grasp it, specifically Roland Barthes' idea of the death of the author, a concept opposing any essentialist definitions of texts, wagering instead that texts become their own living creation outside of their authors, moving to present each new interpretation, moving to present each new reading with a potentially different interpretation as based upon its reader's subjective experiences. As Barthes later wrote in S&Z in 1974, I read the text, and I is not an innocent subject anterior to the text. In readings of Spengler's philosophy, I created multiple interpretations as based upon the changing context and subjectivities of the interpreter. This postmodern approach also stays true to an aspect of Spengler's philosophical relativism. As he wrote himself, truth is that which one does not invent but rather discovers within himself. This paper is split into 3 sections, but rather than the chronological division, for this paper I deal separately with a comparative analysis first of newspapers, then the academic reaction, and finally Spengler's literary interpretation from across the whole time span of my study, rather than just a temporal analysis. This is the alternative structure that I propose, but I'm choosing it in this circumstance to highlight its comparative weakness, as the chronological structuring of my work has been criticized on the basis that the interpretive periods are not absolute, although I have made this clear to many of or some of the academics that have levied that criticism at me. What I hope to do through the interpretive periods, however, is more importantly to emphasize general trends. So I'll begin with the newspapers.
In the first period, the Anglo-American reaction to Spengler's philosophy mirrored the initial German, that being an identification of its pessimism, which it subsequently became quite hostile to, along with its alleged defeatism, which almost all the papers I analysed rejected. The joint context in which Spengler's words were analysed were also similar, as, like with Germany, the millions dead from the war debts and destruction, confirmed a pessimism across the Anglo-American world. Though less so in the United States, but still existing, this shared sense of pessimism also conjoined to the pessimistic literature that had sprung up across the Anglo-American world throughout the 19th century, with the likes of Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, Charles Eliot Norton, Lincoln Steffens, and Brooks Adams. Although the newspapers I analysed generally held to a pessimistic outlook as a form of realism, it was Spengler's determinism most of all that they rejected, refusing to believe that hope had been extinguished in a war-torn world. So the following examples that I raise are representations of this trend. One of the first articles was from 1920 from the Times, which compared Spengler's thesis with Albert de Mangion's less deterministic Le Déclin de l'Europe in 1920, to tell its readers that despite the catastrophes of the present, Spengler had to be rejected and de Mangion accepted because Spengler removed hope from the world and so threatened to further imperil a war-torn German mind. The American Bismarck Tribune in 1920 also rebuked Spengler on even harsher terms in condemning the permanence of the post-war pessimism that he represented, suggesting that modernity was not to be rejected, despite the war, as through its democratic, medical and technological advances, it had proven itself, and I quote, an advantage over all those that preceded it. The Guardian also condemned Spengler's pessimistic sophistries, it called them, in 1926, whose popularity, it claimed, was only owed to the national mood immediately after defeat and revolution. The New York Times in 1926 went the furthest against Spengler's philosophy, though, writing that his theory and its outlook were alike appalling. Like others, it took aim against his vision that the destiny of civilization is destruction, and that there was no power in mankind to stay the event. Few newspapers agreed with the totality of Spengler's prognosis, even those sympathetic. Although the Washington Post in 1924 defended him from the cries of being a defeatist, it refrained from fully endorsing his thought. There was half-hearted support for his predictions from Sydney's The Sun in 1927, and the left-wing Australian Worker in 1932 ran 2 articles supporting Spengler's decline thesis. By contrast, in the second period after 1933, Spengler was transformed into a militant who embraced Prussianism as a means towards rejuvenation. For example, in the context of the Hour of Decision, the Times Literary Supplement reported that the reappearance of Spengler's ideas confirmed the early criticisms directed against him, holding, superficially, that he was a fatalist and pessimist, but on closer observation, it argued, he was far from resigned. He was a defiant believer in the militant mission of Prussia. In 1934, the Scotsman reviewed the Hour as well, writing that Spengler believed salvation could only come through the abandonment of democracy, which, it claimed, was another link with Nazi theory. In some papers, the turnaround in the interpretation was plain. In 1932, the Australian Worker partially agreed with some of Spengler's ideas, but in 1934 it changed its tune, calling him, with his wonderfully clever and blood-curdling book, referring to the decline, a propagandist of fear. This continued in articles produced at his death in 1936 too, as well as during the Second World War. For example, reporting on his death, the Manchester Guardian remarked that Spengler's philosophy was no cry of despair provoked by the German debacle of 1918, and that only the title of his book bore the marks of a prophetic pessimism, in contrast to his actual beliefs, which were sharply antagonistic to the anti-imperialist and anti-militarist temper. From 1945 to 1975, however, in the third interpretive period, I have encountered a problem, that being source material. Whilst there were newspapers that commented on Spengler, I have not found enough to warrant the identification of a trend. So overall, the post-1945 trend is being built much more from the academic and literary fields, which is one of the reasons I structure my written work chronologically, rather than the separate themes of newspaper, academic, and literature. Whilst there have been more articles dealing with the pessimistic prognoses of Spengler's wider theory than ones condemning it as fascistic, I have not found enough on either side. In of itself, this says a lot about the newspaper reception of Spengler post-1945, but they didn't find him interesting enough to comment on him. I now move to the academic reaction. As with the newspapers during the first period, the Academy also largely interpreted Spengler's philosophy along the same lines, attacking its determinism and pessimism in a critique crossing political ideological lines. For example, Irving Babbitt in 1922, a classical liberal intellectual, attacked Spengler's philosophy for eliminating the freedom of choice by individuals to guide and determine their own fates. The American historian Harry Barnes in 1924, later to become a Nazi apologist, similarly condemned Spengler's prognosis of inexorable decline. Although he initially agreed that modernity had increased the stresses on the human organism, no assumption could be drawn from this, he argued, that Western civilization was nearing its end. George Gooch, in 1922, a British historian and Liberal Party politician, also rejected Spengler's work as a philosophical enunciation of pessimism whose publication, he argued, was a misfortune for post-war Germany. Indicative of the pessimistic readings of Spengler's philosophy, however, Gooch went on to praise Spengler's prophetic powers for seemingly predicting a decline when the German Empire was at its zenith. This same interpretation of Spengler as a prophet of German decline, rather than what I think is the more obvious interpretation of his work, which is this dialectic ending in the assumption in the rise of the German Empire, was furthered by Thomas Masaki in 1925, who argued that before the war, the Pan-Germans had acclaimed the decline of the Latins, but in the context of Spengler, they now talk about the decline of the Germans. By contrast, like with the newspapers, from 1933 to 1945, a large bulk of the academic interpretations of Spengler's philosophy interpreted it as fascistic, with a particular focus on the hour of decision and its Caesar prophecy. For example, Friedrich Schumann in 1934 contrasted his reading of Spengler's original depiction of an undesirable but predestined Caesarism in the decline to the hour which welcomed, he argued, the Hitlerian Caesarism originally predicted in the former. Eugene Caden, in the Swansea Review in 1934, also shared these sentiments. Although in 1926 the review had lavished praise upon the decline, in this new edition it contrasted the decline as organising the ills of the Germans into a universal downfall to the hour which desired a Caesarism of the type of the will to power. Spengler's anti-rationalism was also identified by academics as causal agents of National Socialism, as is the case with Mary Asher in 1937, who claimed that Spengler ingrained these ideas into Germany's wider culture through his proclaiming that the supremacy of blood and soil ruled over mind and culture, and this, she argued, supported the growth of the new racial state in Germany with its concentration camps. Reviews of the decline during the second period were also marked by this transformation. In 1935, Ado de Blackham, an Irish academic, made clear the association of Spengler's ideas to National Socialism when he countered the original critics who interpreted the decline as an expression of German despair in time of defeat, instead arguing that Spengler's theories never expressed despair but supported, I quote, the Nazi regime as a historical development that perfectly accords with his general proposition. The American philosopher Roderick Chisholm in 1935 also reinterpreted the decline within the Nazi context, finding its romantic nostalgia for the rural forest, a shared idea found in Hitler, and, being anti-city, could potentially explain the anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party as, I quote, the Jew, as far as the European has ever known him, is essentially a city dweller. The paradigm example of the reinterpretation of Spengler from a defeatist into a revivalistic fascist came from Lewis Mumford, a fellow historian of civilization who was initially favourable to Spengler's philosophy. This was seen in his review of the decline in 1926, where Mumford praised it, describing Spengler's conception of cultural development as brilliant. This was despite his minor objections to its determinism, which appeared, he argued, as an apology for brutality. His 1929 review of the decline's second volume took much the same approach, although with an enlarged view of Spengler as a militaristic German. The transformation of Spengler into a fascist was consummated in Mumford's review of Man and Technics in 1932. Within the context of a deteriorating Weimar Republic, Mumford reversed his original laudation of the decline to write that the intelligent reader could now see beneath its elaborate historical survey a work similar to Houston Stewart Chamberlain's that sought for Germans to return to their ancient gods of blood in order to prepare themselves for the dazzling finale of civilization. Mumford went on to argue that in doing so, Spengler combined the learning of Aristotle with the yearning of Adolf Hitler. Mumford's final extensive encounter with Spengler was published in 1939. Although he stated the value of Spengler's attack against rigorously held philosophical presuppositions, Spengler was still condemned. He was even held up as the representation of a technicized, militarized machine mind who wanted the dystopian winter realized. Mumford then denounced Spengler's philosophy as an assault on culture, calling him the active prophet of that barbarian revolution whose name was fascism. Possibly speaking of his original misinterpretation, as he saw it, of the decline, Mumford claimed that only those whose philosophy was attuned to Spengler's at the time were the only ones who could truly understand its ideas before the full practical context of Nazism were unveiled. From 1945 until 1975, I argued that the pessimistic interpretation within the Academy largely returned, and from the works I've engaged with thus far, it predominated. One of the most notable examples of this was de Reincourt's The Coming Caesars, a book published in 1958 by an American-French academic. And this book charted the developments towards the establishment of a Caesarism in America through the reapplication of Spengler's imperial prophecy away from Germany. Although Reincourt mentioned Spengler in one footnote, the entire book was written in the cast of his theory through its comparative morphology, phrasing, and its sense of decline. Moulded within the context of FDR's presidency, Reincourt identified him as a pre-Caesar and saw his left-wing policies as hastening the demise of constitutional government. However, like with the first period, any agreement that Reincourt had with Spengler ended at his determinism, which posed the coming Caesarism in Spengler as preordained. Instead, as with many of Spengler's interpreters in the first period, hope prevailed with Reincourt, who argued that America still had the chance to avert the oncoming Caesarism through the solid defense of America's Constitution. A similar attempt to balance Spengler's determinism against the power of hope was demonstrated in Northrop Frye's 1974 analysis of Spengler. Possibly one of the most influential, or possibly the most influential Canadian literary critic of the 20th century, Frye reconsolidated Spengler's philosophy into the present, identifying the same conformist, untraditional, and standardized cultural developments in the modern West as Spengler had identified, seeing this as a process of cultural aging. And yet, at the same time, Frye argued that it would be disastrous to give in to a fatalism that surrendered human freedom to blind destiny. As Frye and Reincourt's use of Spengler evidence, the latter's sense of decline, or Spengler's sense of decline, was used to attack negative political developments without the need to agree with the core of its determinism. This was also the case with John Fennelly in Twilight of the Evening Lands, a 1972 biography on Spengler which demonstrated this a la carte tendency most succinctly. Also reapplying Spengler's theory to modern America, Fennelly saw in Spengler one of the best expressions of the spirit of our times, going on to use his sense of decline to identify, I quote, pornography, sexual license, drug addiction, and the megalopolis with all its frightening human, material, financial, and environmental problems as evidences of it. However, when reading through this biography, it appears that all Fennelly did was to associate things he disliked with a vague sense of Spenglerian decline, as he did not actually agree with its determinism, just like Reincourt, Frye, and many of those who engaged with Spengler before him. I now move on to the literary interpretations, which I think is the most interesting part of Spengler's Anglo-American reception. Aligning to the general trend of the first period, Spengler was used by a number of writers to confirm or assist in the construction of their pessimistic outlook. The most notable of these was F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose works focused on the decadence of the American jazz age. In 1940, shortly before his death, Fitzgerald recollected to a friend of the influence Spengler had on his outlook during the 20s. I quote, "I read him in the summer I was writing The Great Gatsby, and I don't think I ever quite recovered from reading him." More than just an off-statement, Fitzgerald's work, especially Gatsby, which was written in 1924, can be read through the pessimistic lens of Spengler's declinism. Placing Gatsby in the context of Fitzgerald's reading of Spengler in 1924, its major characters can be interpreted as interacting in a Spenglerian antagonism between the clashing of new and old, with J. Gatsby representing a dying Southern culture in contrast to Tom Buchanan, his rival, as an obsessive stockbroker in megalopolitan civilization. New York, too, represents the moneyed city and supersedes the rural world of a declining American West. In fact, almost all the major characters herald from the declining rural West and move east toward the megalopolis of New York. The novel also sets itself to a seasonal analogy, beginning in the noonday summer when Carraway was optimistic about his future. He said, "I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again." This seasonal analogy is carried forward to the breaking point in the novel, climaxed by the conflict between Tom and Gatsby fighting in the hotel over their love for Daisy, where the weather is broiling, I quote, "almost the last, certainly the warmest of the summer." Once Gatsby declares his love for Daisy but is rebuked, the metamorphosis of the novel is complete. Tom triumphs over Gatsby as civilization triumphs over culture, and the following chapter begins with an autumn flavour in the air. At the end of the tragedy, the novel concludes in a winter, with Carraway going back west into the winter night and the real snow. And of course, one of the most notable lines speaking to Fitzgerald's interaction with Spengler's work, comes from Tom, who declared that civilization's going to pieces and that I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Fitzgerald as a Spenglerian pessimist was also the main theme of an interview that he gave in 1927. With its title reading Fitzgerald Spenglerian, the interview opened by describing Fitzgerald's writing as forecasting doom, death and damnation to his generation, and that it was the decline which was his bedbook. Asked about the prospects of civilization, Fitzgerald responded with Spenglerian doctrine, arguing that the West had nothing less to produce and that its fine types had vanished after the 18th century, like Goethe and Beethoven. Having identified the metamorphosis of culture into civilization in the exact same period Spengler plotted, Fitzgerald even went on to invoke the comparative morphology itself, citing that Spenglerian signals the death of this civilization and that we are in a period paralleling Rome 185 years after Christ. The pessimism of Spengler, just for a last point, if you want to read a really good analysis of Fitzgerald and Spengler, and Dr. David Engels has produced a very good analysis. The pessimism of Spengler was brought into other novels too during the second period, like Tender as the Night in 1934 and The Last Tycoon in 1941, published after his death, where Spengler was even mentioned by name. Unlike academics such as Mumford, however, Fitzgerald's interpretation of Spengler's philosophy never underwent any sustained revision in the light of the new context of the 30s, as in 1940, Fitzgerald criticised those who tried to reinterpret Spengler's work within the context of National Socialism. Now, I think this is interesting in regards to Fitzgerald's own personal philosophy, when comparing it to the bulk of the interpretations that dominated in that decade. I think that was more a reaction of Fitzgerald not wanting to have his own philosophy condemned or put under attack, because the accusations of Spengler being a Nazi would clearly impact on how people viewed his own philosophy and how he would view his philosophy for himself. Like Fitzgerald, the Irish poet William Yeats also used Spengler's sense of decline and agreed with his pessimistic tone. For example, in 1927, Yeats got a hold of the English translation of The Decline and wrote that he found all the main diagrams of mind contained within it. In 1929, he also wrote that he saw confirmed in Spengler a conception that freed me from British liberalism and all its dreams, to see that the one heroic sanction is that of the last battle of the Norse gods, of a gay struggle without hope that avows ultimate defeat as a test. In two of his later poems, during the second period, Spenglerian overtones are carried forward, and interestingly, in contrast to the Academy and the popular press, a Caesarist interpretation is embraced. For example, in The Guise, a 1938 poem depicting the cyclical renewal of civilization, Yeats posed an intellectually decaying, old rocky face, an allusion, I argue, to a decaying, and others have argued, to a decaying hyper-rational Western civilization in which things thought too long can no longer be thought, against a metaphor of a cavern where comes a voice and all it knows is that one word, rejoice. Thomas Henn, in reviewing the sources for this poem, cited Spengler's vision of the cavern as the meaning behind Yeats's use of it, as a symbol representing the awoken magic Arabian consciousness under the prime symbol of the coming culture, the cavern. Yeats's other Spenglerian poem, Long-Legged Fly, in 1938, can also be interpreted in the positive Spenglerian framework of the Caesar. This is seen in the first stanza. That civilization may not sink, its great battle lost, quiet the dog, tether the pony to a distant post. Our master Caesar is in the tent. In this, Yeats wrote that civilization may not sink because our master Caesar had come, possibly based off Spengler's idea of the Caesar, as the actor attempting to save late civilization. Although there lacks direct evidence that Yeats took Spengler's idea of the Caesar into this specific stanza, the metaphor presents an uncanny affinity, especially as Yeats both engaged with Spengler and was sympathetic to the fascist Caesarean cause in Ireland. In the final interpretive period, I examined the pessimistic interpretation of Spengler's philosophy by the Beat generation. Hippies and counterculture figures, Beat novelists like Jack Kerouac and poets like Allen Ginsberg, who both encountered Spengler during the 40s, used his sense of decline to attack a moribund Western civilization that had torn itself apart again and had failed to resolve its spiritual crisis. At the very start of the Beat movement, this can be seen in two of Kerouac's earliest essays written in 1946, recently translated from French into English in just 2016, titled America and World History, and a couple of facts concerning laws of decadence. In the first essay, Kerouac created a new American culture that was young and unfulfilled, separated from a petrified, decadent European civilization, he wrote, that had destroyed itself, to see American capitalist society, in contrast to a tired European socialism, as evidence of its pure sign of, using Spengler's penchant for over-italicizing his words, irreversibility of soul, a pure sign of American selfhood, developed in the American summer of the late 19th century. What stands out from this essay, as with other writers who used Spengler, was a recognition of a European decline, but qualified with the belief that his own society was not declining, to the point that he cut America off from European culture. This view would later change, though, as Kerouac became much more pessimistic for the prospects of America. In the second essay, a couple of facts concerning the laws of decadence, Kerouac condemned the intellectual as having a cold intelligence and attacked the city intellectual as well as himself as city vermin, but at least he was vermin trying to struggle back to manhood in attempting to claw his way out of civilization. This was based off his contrasting his flicking through his family album when prompted to do so by a New York City radio commentator who had attacked the ideas of family albums and said that he hated the idea of looking back at his family photos because it made him feel afraid. So Kerouac saw that as a sign of the American New York City intellectual afraid of the ideas of familial ties and rootedness back into the past. Using these Spenglerian themes and italicizing his words again, Kerouac then wrote that the city has a general fear of time, and particularly of the past, and it engages in present-centered hedonism as a result, to produce a morally bankrupt society, leading to the end of the race, as in Rome. At the end of this essay, possibly aware of Spengler's politics, Kerouac wrote that he did not wish to be reviled as a neurotic and neo-fascist for criticizing the city intellectual. Taking Spengler further into his thought, in 1957, Kerouac defined the Beat as the second religiousness of Western civilization as prophesied by Spengler. By this, Kerouac referred to a phase of late civilization in Spengler's cyclical model when a new force emerges to overthrow the rule of rational thought, to produce an irrational counter-reaction where people readily desire only to believe and not to dissect through religion. Spengler also aligned this idea to the idea of the Fellahin, an ahistorical people living purely in the present after the fall of civilization. Kerouac used these ideas and words, like Fellahin, throughout his writings, such as in On the Road, a 1957 novel depicting Kerouac's travels across the United States and Mexico, searching for a world of freedom. On the level Kerouac wanted it to be read, though, it was an attempt to find a spiritual grounding for a late civilization that had lost its spiritual foundation. As he wrote of it, I quote, "The early Gothic springtime of Western mankind, before it went on its civilization rationale, will come again, as Spengler says, when the sunset of our culture and the clear late-day glow reveals the original concerns again, with its indifference to things that are Caesar's and a yearning for, a regret for, the transcendental value or God again." It's quite difficult to insert quotes from On the Road into this without the full context of the novel, but I have got some interesting examples of how Spengler was used in this work. So, for instance, it is quite difficult because you're taking it all out of context. But so, for example, in Crossing into Mexico, Saul Paradise, who was Kerouac's fictional representation in On the Road, he recounted as he and Nick Cassidy, Dean, passed the Amero-Indian population that they were, I quote, driving into the places where we would finally learn ourselves among the Fellahin Indians, who were the essential strain of the basic wailing humanity that stretches in a belt around the equatorial belly of the world. Kerouac also then saw this as an unchanging eternity of the Amero-Indians, who he argued, who he went forward to, who noted that they lost their civilization. He also said that destruction would come to the world of history, after which the apocalypse of the Fellahin returns. Again, he writes, he praises Fellahin primitivism, actually, as the way out for the West, out of this decline thesis. But he goes on to write that he noted that all the Fellahin Indians who had the response to civilization all had their hands outstretched for something they thought civilization could offer, but they never dreamed the sadness and the poor delusion of it. So again, this is taking these quotes out of context, but if you read On the Road with the framework of Spengler in your mind, you start to identify all these major Spenglerian themes crop up all throughout the text, not just in the use of the word the Fellahin, but in the way that Kerouac deals with civilization, and with the way that Kerouac deals with Spengler's apocalyptic, according to Kerouac, cyclical vision of history. And this, of course, also takes into account that he was writing some of his letters around 1957, 1956, 1953, in which he was actively discussing Spengler and On the Road within these themes of Spengler. So, like Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg's pessimistic reading of Spengler's ideas also found expression in his writings. This was first evidenced in his reading of biblical Israel's history in 1956, as his poem How, which was famously in America, subjected to an obscenity trial, was finalized. Seeing the completed history of the Jews written out, Ginsberg saw their summertime culmination in wise Solomon's time with, quote, the building of the temple, only to be followed by Spenglerian degeneration, all told in detail, whoring and queerness, and worship of Moloch, until their destruction through dispersion. The worship of Moloch, a demonic god, identified here as part of a Spenglerian degeneration, is a central theme of How. Split into three parts, it is the second section of How, where the Spenglerian Moloch comes alive as the moneyed urban demon antithetical to life. For the city Moloch, Ginsberg wrote, has a mind of pure machinery, or its blood is running money. Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, whose skyscrapers stand in the long street, whose factories dream and croak in the fog, whose smoked stacks and antennae crown the cities, for its soul was electricity and banks. These similar Spenglerian anti-city themes also appear throughout Ginsberg's other poems too, like Death to Van Gogh's Ear in 1957, which preached against the moneyed evils dominating America and held to the distinct difference between cultures, such as that of Asia from America, which Kerouac and Ginsberg discussed with each other in specific reference to Spengler in multiple letters. In fact, in the poem's conclusion, Spenglerian idioms of the moneyed megalopolitan modernity return to condemn the modern world in a Spenglerian dualistic antagonism, posing money, abstract money, against the pure eternity. Spengler was even mentioned by name in two poems. In Kansas City to St. Louis, a 1966 poem, Ginsberg wrote that when Churchill made his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, provincial ears heard the Spenglerian iron terror pronouncement. And in Yes, and It's Hopeless, Ginsberg brought in, I quote, Spengler and Vico's cycles as representing a hopeless happening of ever-recurring nihilisms. In the context of the counterculture of post-war America, writers like Kerouac and Ginsberg align these forces to their own apocalyptic readings of Spengler's philosophy through their search for new values and in their attacks against the old. For both writers saw in Spengler a reservoir of powerful metaphors and analogies. Like Yeats and Fitzgerald, the Beat generation, as thinkers, poets, and artists, were open to the ideas pouring out of Spengler's magnetic philosophy, much more than in the world of journalism and in the academy. Just for some concluding remarks. What I have attempted to show is that Spengler's philosophy was subjected to continual reinterpretations within the Anglo-American world from 1920 to 1975, as a result of the changing social, political, and philosophical context alongside the individual subjectivities of the interpreter. And whilst the periods I eventually demarcated are not absolute, I feel they better identify the interpretive trends from across this period. Of course, there are some interpretations that I did not mention. The realism of Kissinger, the interpretation of Spengler as a representative of a decaying capitalism breathing its final gasp, trying to subvert the communist revolution by convincing the West it was in irreversible decline. That was a common interpretation by communists in the 1930s. Or more recently, John Fahrenkopf's more neoconservative approach to Spengler. On this last point, this continues to show that Spengler is still reinterpreted today. Perhaps he can even be regarded as a prophet of climate change, if, as Fahrenkopf also identified, we carry forward his apocalyptic philosophy from man and technics. This all goes to show that a postmodern approach of Barth's Death of the Author can help to better understand the ways in which Spengler's philosophy has and continues to be interpreted.